Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Jimmy Nguyen. I'll be your host today. Really, really grateful to be here with you. We have a wonderful episode and a wonderful guest on our episode. And welcome to introduce Ashley Carmen to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. Ashley is a licensed psychotherapist that has experience providing therapy for populations recovering from addiction, severe and complex trauma, and incarceration, amongst the various other mood and personality challenges. She's been practicing for 8 years and transitioned into psychedelic medicine after realizing the potential for harmful effects and addiction profiles of other pharmaceuticals. It's now become her mission to share with clients and facilitators alike the healing properties and benefits of psychedelic medicine and other holistic behavioral interventions. She's informed on CBT, DBT, IFS. Those are all therapeutic modalities and mindfulness approaches, and has trained with MAPS for MDMA, assisted psychotherapy, and also the School of Consciousness Medicine for psilocybin guiding training informed by the Mazatec lineage out of, I always say this wrong, Huautla de Jimenez in Oaxaca, Mexico.
Oaxaca.
Say that again?
Oaxaca.
Oaxaca. Thank you. In Oaxaca. Awesome. And her intention in creating an organization called the Psychedelic Guide Network is to merge the intersections of all facilitation and to create a dedicated, rich, and fruitful space where practitioners can come to connect, collaborate, and most importantly, to consult amongst each other. And so this is one solution to preserving all traditions and approaches to the medicine space, and also just in conjunction within the Western medicine model. And additionally, the Psychedelic Guide Network community serves to preserve the freedom of practice within these psychedelic spaces, as there's many diverse approaches to these ancient tools. So welcome, Ashley. Really great to have you here.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat with you this morning.
Yeah, and for our audience, if you've noticed from the introduction for Ashley, that we'll be talking about a couple of topics today, but primarily around the ethical considerations of facilitation. And one of the things that I really appreciate in the conversations that you and I have had, leading up to here, is this kind of larger question on, okay, how do we preserve all of the different modalities and practices as we get this psychedelic boom into the mainstream, into more regulated models and environments. And, one of the things that the audience has heard me say quite a bit in the past is there is this kind of struggle right now to determine who's allowed to do this work, what modalities are legitimate, what aren't, what creates, ethical and sound facilitators and service providers. And these are really, really, really big issues, to tackle.
Right. Big
and
questions.
So, I'm hearing that you're doing this through, the Psychedelic Guide Network. I'm wondering if you could just start by telling us a little bit about that and what the mission and the function of the Psychedelic Guide Network is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Psychedelic Guide Network is, the intention is to bring in multidisciplinary teams of psychedelic guides. So I am really dedicated to keeping the practice of psychedelic medicine diverse. And that means diverse approaches from any training, any lineage, any approach really, and having these individuals come into a peer consultation group to consult with each other. And I say consultation, but really it's a peer-to-peer intervision group because it's non-hierarchical.
Okay.
So in this intervision group, naturally what happens is ethics is mitigated because people are talking about their work. And that was actually the first intention in creating Psychedelic Guide Network, was I wanted to promote more ethical facilitation, promote more ethical guiding after having seen what was going on in the field. And then it became very apparent to me during some time that I spent with a pharmaceutical company developing a synthetic, the FDA for the first time ever was getting involved in mandating therapy in addition to the synthetic psilocybin that was going to be administered. So after having been introduced to that therapy, it became alive for me the second mission in Psychedelic Guide Network is, as you mentioned, preserving the sacredness, preserving the reverence, preserving some of the more spiritual approaches to the medicine, which is not common or typical for the medical model to platform.
Yeah, and it's actually pretty interesting that, what I'm hearing you say is that with the Psychedelic Guide Network, which I'll just mention previously, you might have heard this organization as Altered
Psychedelic,
Psychedelic Practitioners.
formerly known as.
Yep. Now the rebranded site is psychedelicguidenetwork.com. And I actually find it really interesting that you're using almost like this cohort model where facilitators across a lot of different, modalities are interacting, engaging, having conversation, sharing, anecdotes and
Yeah.
lessons. And I'm curious, like, what's the makeup of these cohorts? Do you have folks from like the medical clinical kind of lens? And then do you have folks that lean more on, let's say, the more holistic or even like shamanic lens? I'm just curious, like, how the members are joined together.
Right. Well, one of the biggest qualifiers to be entered and admitted into a wisdom circle is you have to be active in psychedelic guiding. You have to be active in serving medicine. And that's there's a couple other things that we interview potential members for to make sure that they're a right fit for the culture, a right fit for the community. They're aligned with the commitment that's required to be a part of a wisdom circle. But in terms of background training orientation, you can come from any background training and orientation. So the makeup, it's actually been a lot of fun watching these diverse
Sure.
communities come in and come in. I create a culture of non-hierarchical. It's a non-hierarchical space, regardless of how many rites of passage or how many letters you have behind your name. And to watch everybody be there in the spirit of support, in the spirit of intervision, I find myself acting as a bit of a mediator, kind of explaining what does purging mean and what is some of these acronyms, IFS, CBT, DBT, trauma informed, what does that mean? And translating for each other. But there's licensed psychotherapists, there's MDs, psychiatrists. You also have more shamanic, indigenous, native healers, energy healers. There was we had a few yoga practitioners that were including psilocybin in their guiding, breathwork facilitators. So it varies. It varies greatly, and that is the point. Actually, is to get this breadth of practice that's in this space. A breathwork facilitator has a lot to learn from an MD, right, around medications and contraindications, and an MD who's starting their own ketamine clinic also could learn a lot from a breathwork facilitator that can help, teach around non-medicinal altered states and grounding and using breath. So it's been a lot of fun, and it's extremely diverse.
Yeah, one of the things that I always circle around is this. Yeah, I think in the sense of the psychedelic boom that's coming up, I'm a little wary to call it an industry. I'm a little wary to call it a movement because there are a lot of different factions and factors of folks who are, driving their own, agendas with psychedelic work. And what I find, and I really noticed this at the MAPS conference earlier this year, the Psychedelic Science Conference, is everybody's running around acting like they know what they're doing, that they have the protocols, that they have the standards of practice and things like that. Where in reality is that I don't think people know. And I think that there's a lot of folks who are really trying to step out there. Some are guessing, some have more educated guesses, some have been practiced for much longer. And, it's interesting to see that there's a lot of parallel between the Psychedelic Guide Network and what we try to do here at Psychedelic Passage, because we definitely lean more on the private use intentional side. I think within that, within our network, we have folks who have mental health licensure, who are licensed therapists. We have folks who are, yoga nidra coaches and instructors. We have academics. We have folks who are coaches. We have folks who lean more on the spiritual side. And so, we found this really great benefit of having folks from a lot of different backgrounds come together and actually find commonality in some standards of practice, some ethical baseline that everybody can agree to. And so I'm curious, you were kind of mentioning that there are just some standard requirements in joining, the Psychedelic Guide Network. And I wonder, like, what are some of those things that you look for? Like, I guess my question is like, what does an ethical guide look like versus an unethical guide or facilitator, regardless of approach or modality?
Right. Well, I really love that you're hesitant to call it an industry. That resonates with me a lot. I find that this is an ecosystem that's choosing to emerge right now in our culture, in our Western society. People have turned it into a field. People have turned it into an industry. And it's like putting it in a box. It's like putting the psychedelics, putting the medicine, putting everything that the psychedelic experience is in a box and expecting to get it right. And I think that's a little bit of what's happening with, the standards that we're trying to create, the ethics that we're trying to create. People are really trying to put it in a box, and we don't even fully understand the full capacity of what this is. And yet we're trying to put tape on it. We're trying to say that we've, in black and white, figured out how to guide, how to facilitate what this experience should or shouldn't entail. So I really appreciate that perspective. It's very humbling, right? It's kind of like, let's stay in the seat of humility. And ethics is a big topic. I've certainly been trained in some hardcore ethics. I really think it's one of the main missions of licensing boards is to implement fear in those providers that are licensed. And I can see the whole spectrum of it, where I appreciate that there are ethics and there are guidelines to follow, but yet there's just this act in accordance or you'll lose your license. And there's a lot of kind of fear mongering. I would get these magazines from CAMPT, an association I was a part of as a marriage and family therapist, and the last few pages of the book was like, this is how people effed up. Don't lose your license. This is how they screwed up. And there is a collective understanding that we should have around what is ethical guiding and what is unethical guiding. So I just kind of go on that tangent a little bit about governing boards, because the purpose is to protect the public, right, from a harmful provider that's violating ethics. And that's I like that intention. And some of their techniques and tools can go over and result in therapists and facilitators feeling limited in what they can or can't do. Self-disclosure is an example of that. And yes, there are ethics. So, I mean, to answer your question around what are some of the ethics, and I guess like how it relates to like Psychedelic Guide Network, we actually have a code of ethics that I created, and it's compiled from a lot of other organizations that have come before us. And so when I think of ethics, the first thing that comes up for me when working with a client and an ethical guide is informed consent. Does your guide provide you an informed consent? Do you know what you're fully consenting to? Are you fully informed on what this experience is going to entail? No, we can't name exactly what you're going to experience or provide expectations, but there should be a consent that informs you of their bodywork practices or what the arc of the day will look like. So that's the first thing that comes up for me.
That comes up for us a lot, because I think informed consent is a word that's thrown around a lot and not a lot of scrutiny on how that is conducted. And when I think about informed consent, the first part is informed, which is like, is the practitioner giving you enough clean and honest and transparent information for you to make a choice? The consent part means that you have, a choice to either consent to it or not consent. And the biggest faux pas that I see are folks who, we work with a lot of psychedelic curious folks who are engaging with the medicine for the first time, or they're circling back after having some, recreational experiences in the 60s and 70s for our older clients who we love and adore. Some folks are like, I want to follow along with the best models of the clinical trials. And then you have a facilitator who's like, yeah, I've studied it and I know, and I implement this and I implement that. And then in the same token, a journeyer might say, I'm interested in working with somebody who has a connection to traditions and indigenous, lineage. And then a facilitator kind of flubs it. It's like, yeah, I kind of lean this way or that way, or, whatnot. And what I find is that it's somewhat amorphous. Like it can be really challenging. And, particularly, I think the biggest message that I can share with folks, this is both to journeyers and facilitators alike, is just be honest with what your approach
Right.
is. I think there is a difference between having a direct influence of your practice by indigenous lineages and traditions versus being an ally and in respect to those traditions and lineages. I think that there's a difference in trying to adopt some of the things from the clinical trials, or just even to say, hey, I take a little bit more of a clinically directed approach versus not. And I see this be confused all the time, because how does a journeyer verify that? Like, there's no way that a psychedelic curious person can actually verify that without actually going into an experience, with somebody. And I see this being like mistaken and, confused like all the time. And for what it's worth, the clinical trials are very limited. The reason why they exclude certain, mental health conditions, or make you wear overhead earphones instead of loudspeakers in the room, or the music that they use in a lot of these clinical trials is like very directed to evoke certain emotions and feelings, is because they're trying to quantify data.
Right. Yeah. They want significance. They want it to be, statistically in their favor.
So they're trying to standardize to a degree. They're like, let's play the certain song at the 15-minute mark and see if all of our subjects have the same
controls.
Emotive.
Yeah, there's controls in place. It's a research method.
I think that this is a little bit of a cool word of caution for folks, that like, just because it is a clinical trial, just because it does fall under a regulated model or regulated quote unquote industry, as we're trying to move towards, doesn't mean that it's any way superior to other modalities and practices, which I hear you kind of saying in the undertone of like your
That's
organization
right.
as well.
Yeah, the medical model is mainstream. And I think historically, there's been a lot of trust in the medical model. Historically, there's been a lot of trust in the establishments. And feels, without getting too philosophical or political, like there's really a redistribution of power happening, right? And opioid crisis, like I think what we learned through pharmaceutical industry and the medical model and COVID and health, World Health Organization, is that we've been misled in some ways. And the medical model is what's ushering in psychedelics during this time. And the medical model is doing the same thing. They know their paradigm. They do the research method. They need the numbers. They got to test bioavailability if they're going to make a drug or a pharmaceutical out of it. If it's a treatment, it's medical. And so there's standards. And with this modality, with this ecosystem, it doesn't work. It doesn't work the same way. And so I think that old paradigm has been more harmful than helpful. And so, yes, through Psychedelic Guide Network, I'm really supporting the freedom of practice. I'm really supporting and asking people, encouraging people, voting for a paradigm shift. Like a paradigm shift. Can we take responsibility for our health? Can we take responsibility for our consciousness tools? Can we be allowed access and information to make informed decisions in how we want to experience our consciousness and work with our mental health versus taking orders from a top-down model, right? Taking orders from somebody else, sitting somewhere else that's, running numbers and doing all the statistical analysis, telling us, according to that, what's best. So yeah, freedom of practice, right? And there are some that will still feel more comfortable in a white room, in a clinic, in artificial light, kind of doing things by the book. And I'm not against that. Like, I'm okay if that's what individuals want. I'm more about the sovereign individual journeyer getting to choose. And so, and about all of these practitioners in the space being introduced to different modalities so that they also know the clinical model is not the only way. So when I say freedom of practice, it's like, yes, we should be able to have freedom of how we want to practice and how we want to experience it. And so PGN brings all these different approaches and modalities into the room and introduces people. And I'm really intending on keeping the different approaches to this sacred space diverse and accessible.
What I'm hearing you say is that it's not necessarily about what modality is superior than the other. I suspect that your focus is that there should be ethical standards and common practice that can be seen across all, different, modalities. And our society here in the United States is really interesting because actually we have a hard issue of trust, that we have to quantify things, as you were saying, in order for us to feel like things are legitimate. Where I have had plenty of colleagues of mine who are mental health professionals, licensed mental health professionals, who've literally like burned their DSM-5. And that's the for those folks who don't know, that's a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental health. So that's what they use for mental health, diagnoses. And the other thing that's worth mentioning based on what you're sharing is that your trust in the medical model actually depends on your social location. It depends on your ethnicity and gender and whether you're part of a marginalized or vulnerable population. And so we see this in, African American populations, how, folks from those populations have been used as test subjects and have had unethical violations and unequal access to basic healthcare needs.
That's right.
We see this with, Indian health services, which, on the surface is to be able to provide free healthcare for folks who are of Native heritage and can go back, 2 or 3 generations. But then a recent colleague just told me that it's 50% funded and that there's, a lot of challenges around budget and things. And so, it's what ultimately, my sense is that I'm not personally here to say that a medical clinical model is inferior. To your point, I agree with you. People should have a choice. I just don't want the psychedelic world to be built upon a broken system. And we see that with how health insurance works. And we see that with how the wait lists for mental health were during COVID and the pandemic. People had to wait a year probably to even get onto a telehealth, service, with somebody. And so I think that the psychedelic boom, which has been a word that's been recently introduced to me, there is this potential. I think that a lot of people look at psychedelics, it's revolutionary, it can catalyze all this change. But I think just very easily, it can also exacerbate the same systems that are happening and occurring today.
Say more.
Which is who gets to do this work? Who gets access to this work? Who's allowed to do this work? Do you have to have a mental health diagnosis to explore your consciousness with psychedelics?
Right. Gatekeepers.
And gatekeeping. So there's a little bit of a challenge here to where, we're talking about, ethics, but also I think the ethical considerations go much more systemic, I think, than what people realize, And so it's really hard. It's really, really hard. And I think that I think that the narrative right now is what modality is superior than the other. And I guess my notion to the audience here is let's actually zoom out a little bit. Let's actually zoom out and look at how all of this is coinciding with each other. And I like the word that you said, in an ecosystem. And you were saying, there's that part at the end of your study as a psychotherapist where they're like, don't do this, don't do that, don't lose your license. Well, there's plenty of licensed mental health professionals who engage in sexual relations with their clients.
Right.
There are plenty of psychedelic facilitators who also engage in those ethical violations and sexual relations with their clients.
Yep.
Emotional abuse, financial abuse. So it's is that specific to psychedelics or is that specific to
that's universal.
This larger issue?
I think it's pretty universal to any individual that holds any seat of authority or any seat of power. And I would hope that, because I consider it such an honor. It is such an honor. It is such a privilege to be trusted with somebody's personal material, with somebody's psyche, with somebody's soul, with somebody's emotional experience. And I would hope that these individuals feel that too, and have enough integrity to do their own work and to be really clear about their intentions in their interactions and all of their engaging with their client in every situation, and being aware of their own ego desires, spiritual desires, and always checking on it to see if it's manifesting in the relationship with the client. But no, it's not specific to psychedelics. It's very general and broad, and you can blanket it over any profession, I think, that's in a position of holding power, however we want to define that, over a client that they're serving or in service to. They forget that they're in service to that person, right? And the power kind of takes over, and their own interests and desires may prevail is when it becomes harmful.
It's a big honor and also a huge responsibility,
Right.
to hold that in a very protective way.
Yeah.
And I think anytime that there's somebody, I think you said this really well, if there's any time that somebody is seeking the professional services of somebody else, there's already an inherent power dynamic. And folks in our audience have hopefully listened to our power dynamics episode, but you can scroll a little ways back to come and find. And I think it's also interesting what you had mentioned something about practitioners like egos, like getting in the way. And also I'll just share that this is very universal. I think you find this in any professional practice that's like serving others. I personally have seen doctors ego and power tripping. I've seen nurse practitioners doing so. I see the look on your faces. I say that. I've certainly seen, facilitators. And so, my question for you is, how can a journeyer determine whether a facilitator is in service to the client and in service to the medicine versus maybe in a hidden way actually in service to their own identity or their own ego or their own belief as maybe they're the healer and not like the psychedelic medicine?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think even in that question, you phrase it really well. A guide that's sitting in that seat and holding the power and kind of owns that they're the healing agent, right? There's no respect or credit or reverence or honor given to the medicine. They kind of put themselves above the medicine in some ways. They're the healing agent, not the medicine. If that comes through in any way, I think that that's absolutely a red flag and some information that there's a little bit of ego there. Guides also with that kind of a demeanor, their desires, their longings kind of take precedence over what the client's needs are. Their needs are met. I think that they can also be really rigid in the container and in this space, and rigid about what the experience is going to look like without taking into consideration what the client needs. I was actually leading a wisdom circle yesterday, and we had one of our guides kind of bring up this really cool concept of intuitive guiding, where she's aware of kind of like the standards and the, typical arc of the day and the eye mask and the music and being with the client. But she felt intuitively called to create a different container for her client that didn't look like that. All of those things would be available for the client, but the client was working with control. The client was working with rigidity, and she wanted to bring in some flexibility for the client because it was going to be in service to the client. And so, created this container that was more flexible and more intuitive to what the client's needs were. And I think that that's a great example of a guide that's really in healthy relationship with their ego, because it's not about what I'm doing, what I'm setting up. It's more about what the client's needs are. And so, I think you'll know when you're with a guide that is in healthy relationship with their ego, because it won't be about them, right? It'll be about your experience and what your needs are versus their needs, their longings, their desires.
Yeah. Anytime that you have any type of practitioner that says, hey, I know the secrets, and if you follow this 8-step model that you're going to be all of a sudden healed or fixed. And it may not always be overt like that. But one thing that I appreciate you saying is like, where is the emphasis? The emphasis on the practitioner and their modalities, which they should answer those questions if you are curious and asking them. But also I hear that there should be this equal space of actually tuning into your needs as a journeyer, your needs as a client to really learn about you.
Right.
And then the other part that I hear is, how much humility or reverence do they have to the psychedelic, plant or fungi? Like how much that they, give the respect to the psychedelic medicine over their own, practice and whatnot. And one thing that's been really clear for myself as I've been doing this work for a number of years and engaging with a lot of different, facilitators, guides, practitioners, is that is a universal concern across all modalities. I think that there is, to your point earlier of wanting to put things in a box and put some fancy tape over stuff, is that there can sometimes be this desire to make things prescriptive, to make things algorithmic. And in my perception, I see that in both the medical, clinical oriented models and also in ceremonial containers. Like, let me just hit the same playlist and let me do the same, opening ceremony, and let me, have the same, sequence of events. And like broadly, that's going to quote unquote work for the majority of the time.
Right.
But then sometimes that causes you to be asleep at the wheel
Yeah.
as a guide or a practitioner, to where you're not tuned in to the needs of the client, to how they're responding to a certain stimuli or a certain, thing. And so you can see how this is like extremely nuanced. And so that's where I appreciate what you're trying to do through your organization, trying to just, I guess, bring people into the same room to have these conversations. I would say that the most dangerous practitioner, facilitator, guide is the one who's in a silo, who's in their own space doing their own thing, because you don't get feedback. You don't get any, positive or negative critiques. You don't get any opportunity to learn, from others. And that can be really problematic,
Yeah.
It's also just worth mentioning that you come from the School of Consciousness Medicine,
Right.
which for a long time had a lot of credibility in the space. And then the New York Cover Story podcast came out. There was a lot of evidence of unethical treatment of folks, a lot of facilitator abuse in a lot of, different regards. And I don't mean to like dig too much into the past, but I bring it up as an example. Like, for over a decade, that was the gold standard of psychedelic facilitation.
That's right.
And because they went unchecked, because they were in this kind of exclusive closed door silo to the community,
Right.
a lot of this stuff ran super rampant before people were feeling safe to speak out. And even as people were speaking out, they were kind of stifled and silenced and, things like that. And so I'm imagining that informs some of your work now, as far as like wanting to prevent things like that from happening in the future. And just curious if there's anything that you want to, speak to about that as it relates to motivating your work today.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate the invitation. It's all so divine and perfectly orchestrated, and I have no doubt that that's one of the reasons why I'm here promoting ethics and supporting containers for peer-to-peer intervision to help with the checks and balances. And yeah, I mean, I was in community with the leaders of School of Consciousness Medicine, and quite literally like in community with them, sitting with them in my training when the article was published. And I didn't have a long-standing relationship with them. I can't speak to like their context or their demeanors before I began my relationships with them. Much of what I know and much of what I imagine comes from other individuals that have known them for 10, 20 plus years. And it sounds like it very much was a lack of checks and balances, that they had a lot of community. They had a lot of people that were mentees. They were surrounded by therapists and all these other professionals, a lot of licensed individuals actually. But the community that they were surrounded with were people that were learning from them, right? People that had given all their trust into them. And
talk about power dynamics, huh?
Yeah, I don't, from what I understand, right? I can't claim that I witnessed this, but from what I understand and from what I've heard from various conversations, that they went unquestioned, they went unchecked. And because they, had a large following and it kept on growing and they were leaders in this space and they would eventually go above ground, that it was progressive and it was edgy, and it was, they did what they did because they had such a following in a way. And I don't think that they were surrounded by enough actual peers or colleagues that they could consult with around their practices. I don't know, but that's what I imagine. And so when we're operating in silo on an island, I agree, it is, that can be, I think, is the most kind of dangerous guide or practitioner that there are, because, and that's a problem because there's nobody there to mirror you. There's nobody there to reflect back to you. There's nobody there to show you your blind spots, if you will. And it's not the responsibility of the client to be like, hey, this didn't feel so good, or hey, what was that about? It's the duty of the guide to take responsibility for their ego, for their any spiritual or egoic misalignments, ethical missteps. And so without peers, without colleagues, without people reflecting back to your work, you're not going to be aware of those blind spots, and they just keep on manifesting and acting out in the relationship with the client. And that's how a lot of these, ethical missteps, I think, happen. But if you are in a trusted peer-to-peer intervision group, or, a mentor supervisor relationship, you have somebody reviewing that you're talking to about your work, you're in a trusted space where you get to open up about your work. And these groups are professional development because we're talking about their work, their work, but it's also personal development, because when we're out of alignment ethically, it's because of a personal process. There's something off personally, and that feels vulnerable. And when you're in a trusted peer-to-peer network with people that respect you and trust you, one of our cultural agreements in Psychedelic Guide Network is that we believe in the inherent good of the individual. We believe that they're well-intentioned. We start there, and we get to challenge and check and get curious around change, around what they're doing. So it's a safe place to confront those things, explore those things, and have those things reflected back to you. But when you're on an island, yeah, you've got it all figured out. You've got 8 steps and that's it. And you're the healer. That's all they need is you.
Yeah. And if you have enough followers of that, then that can there's that self-validating process that we saw in the School of Consciousness Medicine. And I think the other
echo chambers
problematic thing that I had observed from afar, because I've chatted with folks in the community, throughout the years, but I by no way know directly and intimately what it looked like. But one of the problematic pieces that I saw was that all the clients were destined to become facilitators. And so you had this system of, your teaching practitioners, and the practitioners would go out and find clients. And then after a couple of medicine sessions, the clients were also in training to become practitioners.
Yeah.
And there is this really interesting thing where there's this dynamic where folks can go through psychedelic experiences and they're like, this is my calling. This is what I'm doing. I'm going to become a psychedelic healer or a psychedelic facilitator. And I think that I don't want to discredit that all the time. But one thing that I want to share is that not everybody has the skill set, the ethical consideration, has the ability to hold sacred space, has the personality, has the level of care, has all of that to become a facilitator. And so that's, pretty interesting to see, when we compare that to like regulated models in Oregon, there's, a certain handful of training organizations. And even both in Oregon and Colorado, there's no stipulation for supervision for new facilitators.
It just boggles my mind.
I think the hours are very low.
It blows my mind.
I think that, there's like, you go through 100 hours, 200 hours, something like that, and boom, you're good to like become a facilitator. And so you can see how, like, I guess the point that I'm making is that these issues exist no matter if you're in a regulated market or not. And I actually think the more challenging part is how do we do this in the community models? If we're talking about what you're saying about preserving the sovereignty, of journeyers. And so, when we were coming into this, we were saying that the audience is likely going to have more questions than answers as we're leaving this. And so I want to...
Yeah, we're still figuring it out too.
But I feel like you were maybe about to share something.
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of thoughts come up as you were talking about, all of the clients then were destined to become practitioners. And what came up for me as you were talking about that is dual relationship also, which when we talk about ethics and a lot of the dual relationship and multiplicity of relationships that they held with their clients, that can lead to ethical concerns. The relationship gets very confusing when you're guiding a client in a psychedelic journey and then you're meeting them at the festival the next weekend for a recreational experience, or you're guiding a client in a journey and then, they're babysitting your kids the next week, or, there's
Wow.
these
Yeah.
relationships need to be clean. They need to be clean. They need to be clear. You have to know the boundaries of the relationship, not just touch. And touch is very important, but also what are the boundaries and the parameters of the relationship? That is an
Mm.
ethical consideration. And I think a lot of guides, and maybe potentially in that community also, there was a lot of overlap. There's multiple relationships that people were holding with each other, and it became unclear.
Mm.
And I don't think, guiding and facilitating is for everybody. I love that people are so inspired and motivated because of the transformational experiences that they've had. But it really, it does require a certain type of person, and it requires a certain level of experience, not just 1 weekend or 1 month or even a 6-month program. It requires reps. I was required to
Mhm.
get 3,000 hours before I could be off on my own. And even then, I wasn't on my own. I was still engaging in different groups for consultation and supervision. But I was required to get 3,000 hours of reps, 3,000 hours of sitting in front of another person with trauma, with severe depression, with severe anxiety, with psychotic disorders. Like, I had to feel it out and find my way and be supervised in that before I could just go off and do it on my own, have my own license and claim to be able to do that work. And, it's where the wisdom comes from. It's not enough to just have an education or to have a training. You need to have lived experience in these places, guiding and your own personal journeys, your own personal experience. I think one of the questions a journeyer should ask a guide is, when was your last journey? What was your experience when you sat with this medicine? There's many questions to ask, but it requires a whole lot of hands-on experience and collaborative peer-to-peer intervision or supervision before you get to leave the nest and fly off and be competent, I think.
These are really, really big themes for, our organization, as well. Like, one of the things that I look for when I'm vetting, facilitators is obviously their experience and their reps. And, we have a requirement of a minimum number of like clients served. And oftentimes that number continually gets like bumped up, and to comment on something that you had said before is that I really actually like to challenge people's beliefs and modalities just to see how they respond,
Mm.
just to really see if they are open to having their practices challenged, to having their modalities, beliefs, ways of working with the medicine to be questioned, to be challenged, because, you can respond in a somewhat of a confrontational way, or you can respond in a way that invites in just alternate thought and alternate, opinions. And that's often a pretty telling, thing for me. And, as we wrap up this episode here, the one thing that I really want to highlight that I know is really important to you is that piece that you said about journeyer sovereignty,
Mm.
that protecting of the journeyer's freedom of choice. And I know you had said this before the episode, but just the belief that an individual should still have access to the facilitator of their choosing, regardless of modality, regardless of regulated models and environments, regardless of how the community is held. And it's important, that folks are asking questions, which is a little bit why we framed up this episode like this, because I don't think either of us claim to have any answers, but we're asking the question. And I
Mhm.
think that that's the most important that a psychedelic curious person or a journeyer can do,
Right.
is to ask the questions and check in with your intuition on the type of response and things. So thank you so much for joining us, Ashley. Really, really grateful to have you here. That wraps up our episode for today. You can find episodes of the Psychedelic Passage podcast anywhere that you get your podcast episodes, primarily Apple Music and Spotify. We also post these episodes onto YouTube and our social media as well. We really, really look forward to continuing this dialogue of the conversations that are not happening in the mainstream of the psychedelic boom. So thank you so much, Ashley. Thank you to our listeners, and we look forward to tuning in with you all next week.
Gratitude to you, Jimmy. Thank you so much for the work you're doing. Appreciate it.
Thanks.